All right, so here's what you need to know. The small business rules in the Federal Acquisition Regulation just went through a complete overhaul. And I mean complete. We're talking about FAR Part 19, the rule book that controls how federal agencies set aside contracts and give opportunities to small businesses. Now, if you're in the government contracting space, whether you're selling cybersecurity services, building infrastructure, providing consulting, or manufacturing actual products, this rewrite is going to touch your business. It changes the landscape for how you discover opportunities, how you position yourself in proposals, and honestly, who's standing across from you when you compete for that contract. Here's how I want you to think about this. We just went from the old playbook to an entirely new edition. Same game, but some of the fundamental rules just shifted. And if you're not paying attention to what changed, you could miss out on opportunities, or worse, find yourself non-compliant without even realizing it. So in this video, we're going to break down the key changes. What's different, what stayed the same, and most importantly, what you need to do about it to protect your pipeline and maybe even expand it. Definitely pour yourself that second cup of coffee for this one, because we've got some ground to cover. Let's dive in. So let's talk about what we're leaving behind. The old Part 19. And honestly, it was a mess. Picture that one closet in your house, you know the one, where you've just been shoving stuff for years. You open it, and sure, everything's technically in there somewhere, but good luck finding what you need when you're in a hurry. That was the old Part 19 FAR. The rules existed, absolutely, but they were scattered everywhere. Need to know how contracting officers should support small businesses? Well, that guidance was tucked away in one subpart. Want to understand what role the SBA plays in set-aside decisions? Great. Check about 5 different sections and cross-reference. It was bureaucratic scavenger hunt at its finest. And then there's the 8A program. Now, don't get me wrong. The 8A program serves an important purpose. But under the old rules, it got so much attention and preferential treatment that if you were an 8A certified firm with a contract, it basically became your sole source contract. The only way anyone else could compete for it was if SBA formally released it back into the market. For everyone else, the hub zone firms, the women-owned businesses, the veteran-owned companies, you were often left standing outside, watching opportunities cycle through 8A again and again, wondering if you'd ever get a shot. That was the landscape. Frustrating, confusing, and frankly, not exactly fair. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually played out in the real world of government contracting. Say you're an 8A certified company and you've been running an IT help desk contract for a federal agency. It is a 3-year deal and you're coming up on the end of that performance period. The agency still needs help desk support. That requirement isn't going away. So there's going to be a follow-on contract, right? Here's where the old rules created this interesting dynamic. Under the old Part 19 FAR, the default assumption was, well, this was 8A before, so it stays 8A moving forward, unless the Small Business Administration formally released that requirement from the program. It was almost treated like the 8A program had first dibs, permanently. Now, what if the agency wanted to open things up? Maybe they wanted to set it aside for hub zone businesses or service-disabled veteran-owned companies instead. They could do that, but it required extra process, more SBA coordination, more justification. It wasn't seamless and required additional work by the contracting officer. So what happened? The 8A incumbent had a pretty comfortable position. They knew that contract was likely staying in their program unless something unusual happened. Meanwhile, other qualified small businesses were standing on the sidelines, watching opportunity after opportunity get recycled through 8A, never getting their chance to compete. It created winners and losers, not necessarily based on capability, but based on which certification you happen to hold. So that was the old world. Now let's talk about what we've got today. And honestly, This is where things get a lot better. The new Part 19 FAR is what happens when someone finally decides to clean out that messy closet and organize it. Everything's been completely restructured, and here's the good part. It now follows the actual life cycle of how contracts work. Think about your typical procurement. First, there's the pre-solicitation phase, planning, market research, deciding on set-aside strategies. Then you've got the solicitation and award phase, evaluation, protests, all that fun stuff. And finally, there's contract execution and administration, what happens after award. The new Part 19 FAR is organized exactly that way. It mirrors how contracting actually flows in the real world, not how some regulation writer thought about it back in 1984. What does that mean for you? No more hunting through 6 different subparts trying to find one answer. No more cross-referencing sections that seem to contradict each other. The rules now flow in a logical sequence that makes more sense. And here's another upgrade. A lot of the detailed technical requirements have been moved into the actual solicitation provisions and contract clauses themselves. So when you're reading an RFP, the relevant details are right there in the document, not buried in some obscure reference you have to track down separately. It's not perfect, but it's a massive improvement. The closet's finally organized. Now, let's talk about something that survived the update. And this is important because it's probably the most fundamental protection small businesses have in federal contracting. It's called the Rule of Two. And if you've been in this space for any length of time, you know it by heart. Here's the deal. If a contracting officer reasonably expects that at least 2 capable small businesses will submit competitive bids at fair market prices, they must set that work aside exclusively for small business. This applies to everything above the micro purchase threshold up to the simplified acquisition threshold. That rule, still here, still intact. It made it through the rewrite without getting watered down, and that's genuinely good news. But, and there's always a but, right? There's a new wrinkle you need to know about. Under the updated rules, contracting officers now have to document their decision when they choose not to set aside a requirement for small business, even when small business participation might be feasible. They can't just quietly slide something into full and open competition anymore without explaining why. And here's the kicker. The SBA has procedures in place to challenge those decisions. So, if you're tracking an opportunity and you're thinking, wait a minute, this should absolutely be set aside for small business. Why isn't it? You actually have a path to push back now. There's a formal mechanism to question that decision. It's not a guarantee you'll win that challenge, but at least there's accountability built into the process now. All right, here's a change that's going to save you some serious headaches, especially if you're working with indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, or associated task orders. Under the old rules, every single time an agency issued a task order under your contract vehicle, they could require you to recertify your small business status. Every single time. You'd be in the middle of cranking out a proposal with a tight deadline, and suddenly you're filling out forms to prove your SBA status. It was administrative ping pong at its absolute worst. In the new Part 19 FAR, that requirement has been dramatically scaled back. You're not going to be stuck re-representing your size and status at every order level anymore. Now, there's way less paperwork on the order side of things. You can actually focus on what matters, writing a competitive technical proposal instead of drowning in certification forms. But, and this is critical, streamline does not mean you get to be careless. You still have to maintain accurate certifications. You still need to track your recertification events under SBA rules. If your size standard changes, if your revenue bumps you into a different category, if your ownership structure shifts, you're still responsible for updating that information appropriately. The difference is you're not doing it repetitively for every single order. It's about eliminating unnecessary redundancy, not eliminating accountability. Bottom line, Less admin burden, more time to focus on winning work. That's a win. Okay, so when Part 19 rewrite was first announced, I saw a lot of panic in the small business community. People were asking, wait, did the SBA just lose all its authority? Are they being pushed out of the process? No, absolutely not. Take a breath. Here's what actually happened. The rewrite cleaned up a ton of redundant language about the SBA's advocacy role and oversight responsibilities. It trimmed down all those repetitive references that were scattered throughout the old regulation. But trimming text is not the same thing as eliminating authority. The SBA still controls every major lever in the small business contracting world. They set size standards. They determine program eligibility. They manage certifications for 8A, HubZone, service-disabled veteran-owned, and women-owned small businesses. They handle size protests and appeals. And here's the key thing to understand. The SBA's power doesn't come from the FAR. It comes from the SBA's own regulations and from the Small Business Act itself, actual law passed by Congress. The FAR just references how agencies interact with those rules. So think of it this way. The FAR got an editorial cleanup. They removed duplicate language and streamlined references. But the SBA is still firmly in the driver's seat when it comes to deciding who qualifies as small, who gets into set-aside programs, and how disputes get resolved. Less clutter in the regulation doesn't mean less muscle behind it. The SBA's authority is intact. All right, now we get to the real game changer in this rewrite. And this one is huge if you've been frustrated by the old system. Remember that IT help desk contract we talked about earlier? The one where the 8A incumbent basically had a lock on the follow-on work? Yeah, that dynamic just got flipped on its head. Under the revised Part 19 FAR, agencies now have genuine flexibility to move a follow-on requirement out of the 8A program and into a different small business set-aside, whether that's HubZone, service-disabled veteran-owned, or women-owned small business. And here's the critical part. They can do this without needing the same level of SBA approval and bureaucratic hurdles that used to exist. The process is smoother, faster, and more realistic for contracting officers to actually execute. So what does this mean in practice? If you're a HubZone firm or an SDVOSB company, this is your moment. Work that historically cycled through 8A over and over again, it's now actually accessible. Agencies can look at their small business goals and say, you know what? We need to boost our HubZone numbers this year, and move that requirement accordingly. But if you're an 8A incumbent, this is your wake-up call. Follow-on contracts aren't automatically staying in your program anymore. You can't assume that requirement is yours just because you performed well. The playing field just got a lot more competitive. Bottom line, the lock has been broken. Competition is about to get more interesting. So what does all of this actually mean when you're out there chasing opportunities and putting together bids? First, understand that requirements can now jump lanes. That contract you've been tracking that's been cycling through 8A for years, it might suddenly pop up as HubZone only or SDVOSB only on the next go-around. Agencies have flexibility now, and they're going to use it to meet their various small business goals. Second, yes, there's less administrative burden with those repetitive certification forms. But don't confuse streamline with sloppy. You still need to track the big events, mergers, acquisitions, ownership changes, novations, anything that triggers a size recertification requirement. Stay on top of that. Third, and this is critical, your voice matters more than ever now. With fewer rigid, the contracting officer shall do X, Y, and Z to help small business requirements in the FAR, it's on you to show up during market research. Respond to those RFIs. Engage in sources sought notices. Attend industry days. If you want to shape requirements in your favor, you need to be in the room early. And here's a big one for service-disabled veteran-owned businesses. You can now get sole source awards even if an 8A firm is currently performing that work. The doors just opened wider for you. Bottom line, the new Part 19 FAR doesn't eliminate opportunities, it shuffles the deck. If you pay attention, show up early, and understand how multiple programs work, you'll have more shots at winning. But if you're sitting back assuming the follow-on is mine because it's always been mine, you might be in for a very rude awakening. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The question now is, what are you actually going to do with this information? First thing, go look at your supply chain pipeline right now. Specifically, look at any follow-on opportunities you've been counting on. If you've been assuming that contract's staying in my set-aside category because it always has, you need to rethink that assumption. The landscape just changed. Second, get visible during market research. I'm talking about sources sought notices, RFIs, industry days. Anywhere the government is asking, how should we structure this requirement? You need to be there. If you don't show up to explain how to make a requirement more accessible or more aligned with your program, someone else will. Or worse, nobody will, and you'll lose the opportunity entirely. Third, keep your certifications squeaky clean. These FAR changes don't protect you from size protests or program eligibility challenges. Make sure your NICS codes are accurate, your size status is current, and your program certifications are up to date. Don't give anyone ammunition to knock you out of competition. And finally, learn how multiple programs work. If you only understand 8A and nothing else, you're limiting yourself. Understanding HubZone, SDVOSB, and WOSB programs gives you more doors to knock on. Cross-program knowledge is your competitive edge now. The new rules are here. You can either learn them and use them to your advantage, or you can ignore them and watch opportunities slip away. Your call. If you've got questions or want to dive deeper into any of this, drop a comment below. Let's keep this conversation going.